Good morning, and this is Miss Beth here, ready to read chapters 9 and 10. Uh, Refreshing your memory, which I like to do, refresh mine every day. um, Chapter 7 was called Dead Man's Coat. Why was it called Dead Man's Coat? Give you a minute to think. Well, we know there's a bunch of dead men, and the mail boat is coming, right? And they dress up one of the guys to wear the dead man's coat so he can look like the admiral that's awaiting the mail, right? Or Mr. Vander. I guess he is Mr. Vander. That must be the admiral's name, Mr. Vander. Oh. Anyway, so they do that. They dress up and they get the mail. And they say, what about the bodies? Right? The end of that chapter. So the next chapter is called Dragging the Dead. We read that. Chapter 8 was Dragging the Dead, and they drag them all the length of a football field. That's 100 yards. It said it was 100 yards, and they had to drag 8 bodies, so 16 boys, and they did the math on that, right? 8 and 8, 2 apiece. Could take it, and then that turned out to be too heavy. They were very wet and very heavy and dead. So they did 4 boys to the 8 boys, so that meant 2 trips each for 4 of them. In groups of 4, they carried them down, each with a hand and a foot. Oh. Anyways, pretty gross. And they get down, they drag them down and put them in. At the very end, I like what he says here. What Colin is one of my favorite characters here. Jonathan says, "Fun with him in charge. He'll be worth than the admiral." Colin looked down at Admiral's empty stare. "No offense. Sebastian's not in charge." Jonathan assured him. "No one is. It's just all of us. He's not taking over." Colin looked up at him into Jonathan's eyes and frowned his little frown. "Just wait and see. The inmates are running the asylum." "The inmates are running the asylum? What does that mean?" Colin shrugged. "It's just a saying." "Who says it?" "People." "When do they say it?" The Admiral's head rocked. Colin sighed and put his shoulder under the Admiral's uncooperative arm. "When everything starts to go wrong." So the inmates are running the asylum. The asylum was a place where they would put people that had mental health issues, I should say, and put them away, which is not really what is the right thing to do. But anyway, and they would all be together in this place, and then he says, the inmates, that means the people that are living there, are running the place. So anyway, so at the very end of that chapter, put him in the freezer, and Jonathan hears a clinking sound and a clanging sound, a metal sound, and a key had fallen out of the Admiral's jacket pocket. It was a big, rusty, old-fashioned kind, and he took it and put it into his pocket. All right, that's 7 and 8. Now let's go for 9 and 10. Chapter 9, I told you, was called Scar Island. Interesting. "Okay," Sebastian began when they all met at the table, exhausted and limp from dragging dead bodies across the 100 yards of stone. "First things first, I'm in charge." Colin turned his head to give Jonathan a very meaningful look. Jonathan bit his tongue and didn't look back. Sebastian was sitting in the Admiral's chair, big wooden chair, his feet up on the table. Benny was sitting next to him, with Roger and Gregory nearby. "Why are you in charge?" Tony asked. "Because I say so, Tony. We can't have no one in charge. It's be dumb. And I've been here the longest, and I'm the oldest." "I'm older than you," Gerald protested. "Shut up, Gerald, and I'm in charge. Anyone have a problem with that?" "Do we have another choice?" "No." "Could we have an election?" "No." "And you better shut up right now, Colin." Let it go, Jonathan whispered through his clenched teeth, nudging Colin. It'll be fine. Colin shook his head and frowned. His hand flitted up to pinch nervously at his neck. Okay, now that that's settled, first rule is, Sebastian smiled like a cat with a mouthful of feathers. He spread his hands wide. There are no rules. There was a little scattered clapping amongst the group. There was some nervous laughter. Sebastian looked around at them, a little frown on his face. Why do you guys look so scared? No one answered. Eyes dropped to the floor. What's wrong with you guys? This is the best thing that ever happened to us. There was still no answer except the sound of the rain still pattering in the courtyard outside the window. Sebastian jumped to his feet. What? You think you can't do this? You think we can't take care of ourselves and have some fun? Sebastian shook his head. Come on, the stupid admiral. He called us scabs, right? Sebastian's face darkened. Picked off and thrown away, he said. But now he's gone. And here we are, still around. 'Cause you know what, when you can get what you get when you keep picking at a scab? Bloody fingers, Miguel suggested. An infection, Walter asked. No, Sebastian spat. You get a scar, idiots. A scar, and scars are tough. The admiral was wrong. We ain't scabs. We're scars. Yeah, Benny piped up eagerly. Scars, man. Noticing Benny. Benny was the admiral's, he was following him around and doing whatever he wanted, kind of what you call a kiss up in some circles. I would never use the term, but he finds out who's in charge, and he just hangs around them all the time and looking for attention and respect from them. Anyway, maybe get a better deal that way, So anyway, yeah, Benny piped up. Scars, man. Jonathan's stomach suddenly twisted and tightened. He blinked quickly and rubbed at his sleeves with sweaty palms. Sebastian's mouth spread into a grin and he opened his arms wide. Look around, guys. This whole place belongs to us. We're the kings. No one to boss us around. No one to get us in trouble. It's our island now. Ours. We don't need anybody. 'Cause we're scars now. Scars with a capital S. The tough scars that got left behind. It's our island. Hell yeah, Roger cheered in a deep voice. Our island. Our island, Gregory echoed. Sebastian slammed his fist down on the table, his face glowing with triumph. This whole island belongs to us scars. Scar Island, Benny crowed. Sebastian had them now. There were cheers and smiles and high fives. Even Walter was nodding his head, grinning. This ain't Slabheads anymore, Sebastian hollered. It's Scar Island from now on. Say it. Scar Island, all the boys shouted. All the boys except Colin, who just sat looking around, pale and frowning, and all the boys except Jonathan, still rubbing his arms and blinking. Sebastian sat back down, his face flushed. The jerks are gone, he said. We can do whatever we want. There was more clapping, more cheering. Yay, clapping. Except we should eat meals together, I think, Sebastian added. To check in. Make sure we're all okay. That makes sense, right? He looked at Jonathan. Jonathan dropped his hands quickly from his arms. He shrugged and nodded. So do whatever you want, guys. Run around, eat some more, whatever. But be back here for dinner. Have fun, Scars. Everyone sat and looked at each other for a moment. Then Francis stood up and started toward the kitchen. David got up and headed for the door that led outside. Wait, Jonathan said. What about the generator? We still need electricity, right? For the fridge and the freezer. Sebastian pursed his lips. Oh, yeah, right. Well, take turns. It only has to get done. What, like 3 times a day? He looked to Benny, who nodded eagerly. We've all done it. We know how it works. So first, how about you and you, he said, pointing at Miguel and another kid Jonathan didn't know yet. Head down and fill it up. They grumbled and drudged away together. Slowly the rest of the boys wandered away in different directions, most in groups of 2 or 3. Sebastian headed out into the courtyard. Benny followed like a puppy at his heels. Colin and Walter and Jonathan were at the last left at the tables. Colin still looked unhappy. Cheer up, Jonathan said to him. Now the good times start. Jonathan just rolled his eyes. So, what is there to do around here? Jonathan asked. It was Walter's turn to roll his eyes. Who knows? All we ever did was work, man. Mop the floors, clean the kitchen, scrub the toilets. I've been here weeks, and I bet I ain't seen any more of this place than you have. Walter hop- Walter hopped up to join him, and after a moment, Colin did too. We're going to need lanterns, Colin said with a sigh. I know where they keep them. Hatcheth, too. Matcheth, too. A lantern and matches. A few minutes later, the three of them were walking through one of the snaking, shadowy hallways that had been so confusing to Jonathan the night before. Jonathan and Walter each held a hissing lantern. This place is like a maze, Jonathan said, moving his lantern from side to side to banish suspicious shadows in the corners. It is a maze, Walter said. I heard they built it that way on purpose to confuse the crazies, so only the guards would know their way around, you know. Jonathan slipped on an especially slimy stare, and, putting out his hand to catch himself, almost grabbed a huge brown rat. He jerked his hand back, and the rat squeaked angrily and slithered into a hole between two blocks. Well, he said, standing up, if they weren't crazy when they got here, I bet it didn't take long to get that way. Walter looked uneasily at the hole the rat had disappeared into, and reminded of this page in the book, huh? Clever, clever, clever. Yeah, man, you got that right. He shook his shoulders in an exaggerated shiver. This place gives me the heebie-jeebies, thinking about all them crazy that lived here and died. He dropped his voice to whisper. It echoed in the corridor like a turning pages. He looked from Jonathan to Colin. You guys believe in ghosts? Colin shook his head, but he didn't look so sure. I don't know, Jonathan said, squinting into the blackness ahead of him. But if there are ghosts, this sure seems like the place they'd be. Yeah, Walter answered, no lie. He looked at Jonathan. He had second thoughts written all over his face. Jonathan put on a smile that was a lot braver than he felt. Well, let's go find them then. Walter shook his head and almost smiled. Fine, I'm following you, though. They wandered up and down staircases and peeked into sinister-looking side passages. Jonathan was hopelessly lost within minutes. They found one room they were pretty sure used to be some sort of dungeon. Rusted chains dangled from the walls. They took a quick look and then kept going. Suddenly, the light of Jonathan's lantern fell on something familiar. It was a rope, stretched across a staircase, spiraling down into the darkness. Hey, I know where we are. Mr. Warwick showed this to me. Colin and Walter stood shoulder to shoulder with him. Yeah, Colin whispered. He loved to try and scare us with this. The doctor the door to the deep, he called it, Walter said in a low voice. The hatch, Jonathan nodded. What's really down there? He felt both Walter and Colin shrug beside him. No one knows, man, Walter whispered. They'd never tell us. Some big dark secret, I guess. From the stairs rose the same thumping and slurping Jonathan heard the night before. He swallowed and stepped forward and lifted the rope. He ducked his head beneath it and stepped down onto the top stair. What are you doing? Colin hissed. I want to see it, Jonathan answered. He took another step down, then another, holding his lantern out before him. When he didn't hear any footsteps behind him, he looked back. Colin and Walter were still standing on the other side of the rope in the corridor. Come on, he whispered. His voice echoed eerily in the tight staircase. Don't make me go alone. Things are always bigger and darker when they're secret. Let's find out how bad it really is. Walter gulped. Then he ducked under the rope and followed Jonathan. No way, Colin said. I'm staying here. Suit yourself, Jonathan said, but we've got both lanterns. Colin scooted under the rope and joined Walter. Jerks. Jonathan reached back to pat Colin on the shoulder. Relax, he said. Whatever's down here can't be worse than the dead admiral, and we spent plenty of time with him today. Shut up and go. The stairs were steep, and the boys held one hand against the slippery walls to steady themselves. The steps curved down around a corner and stopped at a small, dark landing. The landing was a little bigger than a bed, and on the other side another staircase climbed up and away from them, in the opposite direction of the one they'd come down. On the wall of the landing was another doorway, smaller and rounded at the top. The scraping, slurping, knocking sounds were coming from the smaller doorway. They were louder here, closer. Goosebumps popped out on Jonathan's arms. He held his lantern out in front of himself as far as he could, toward the doorway. Through the doorway was another staircase. It dropped down into even deeper darkness. The lantern's light couldn't reach the end of it. He felt Colin breathing in one of his ears and Walter in the other, looking over his shoulder. "I ain't going any farther," Walter whispered. The darkness down the doorway sloshed and chunked. "Me neither," Colin breathed. "Fine," Jonathan said. "I'll go by myself." "Why?" Colin asked. "Why don't we just go back, Jonathan?" Jonathan stared down into the darkness. He answered up without turning his head. His voice echoed back at him from the dark downward passageway, like he was talking to himself. "It's this big, awful secret, right? The hatch down here in the dark. Well, maybe once you know it, it's not all that terrible after all." He looked back over his shoulder and locked eyes with Walter. "Maybe it's the hiding that makes it horrible, you know?" Walter furrowed his brows. Not really, man. I think we should get out of here, like, fast." Jonathan turned back toward the rattling, grinding blackness. "Big, dark secrets can't stay that way forever," he murmured. His free hand rubbed absently at the wrist that was holding the lantern. A dull, heavy thud echoed up the stairway toward them. "Jonathan!" Walter's whisper was right in his ear. "I am really, really, really," he paused, "hungry. When you're done playing with the monsters, you can find me in the kitchen eating sausage. I'll be with him," Colin added. "Thanks, guys," Jonathan said, and his only answer was the sound of their footsteps retreating back up the spiral staircase. He held the lantern in a shaking hand and shuffled to the end of the landing, to the very edge of the final staircase. This was one narrower than the other corridors. The walls weren't much farther apart than Jonathan's shoulders. Jonathan took a deep breath. Before him there was another loud clunk and a snuffling sound like a huge hissing nose. When he blew his breath out, it came out shaky. He took the first step down. Let me see. I would put this light off, see if that's better. Yeah, that's kind of cool. He took the first step down. The steps were bigger drops down than the other staircase. He had to fall the last couple of inches. He took the next step down. He almost turned and ran when an especially loud metal rattling rang up from the darkness below. But he licked his lips and took a breath and dropped down another step. And another. The darkness before him growled and crunched. The walls seemed to close in around him. He felt with his foot for the next step and realized that he was at the bottom, and that somewhere along the line he had squeezed his eyes shut. He opened his eyes. He was in a tiny square room with a stone ceiling so low he could have reached up and touched it. It was freezing, and the walls were covered in dripping moisture as if they were sweating. In front of him was a huge round metal door. Heavy iron bolts circled its outer edge. It was rusty and grimy, covered in shiny green slime. It looked ancient. The door was big enough that, if it had been open, and he was extremely thankful that it wasn't, he could have stepped through it without ducking. It was a door like a submarine would have, with the large iron handle in the middle that Jonathan knew would open the door if he spun it around. The door seemed to rattle rhythmically, like it was breathing. The door was like a submarine door, and it was breathing. Oh. "The hatch," Jonathan whispered. He stepped toward it. He reached out with his empty hand. He could see the trembling in his fingers. They closed around the iron handle in the center of the door. As his fingers touched the metal, his eyes dropped down to a round shadow at the foot of the door. The wavering light from his lantern flashed across it. A human skull. White bones spotted with green slime propped against the grimy stone doorway. Black eye sockets gaping right at him. Toothy mouth frozen in a silent scream. The door suddenly rocked and banged against his shaking hand. There was a tremendous crack and a wet, sloshing thud, and a freezing mist sprayed Jonathan in the face. He screamed and fell back, slipping on the wet stone. The lantern dropped from his hand and landed on the hard floor with a shattering crash. The light went out, plunging Jonathan into absolute eye-choking darkness. I can't believe I read this before and I don't remember that. Huh. Wow, how could I not remember that? Reading it too is making it very vivid to me. So that was the end of chapter 9. Jonathan has gone on an exploration, starting with Colin and Walter, but it ending by himself at the hatch. This door. And there's a dead skull at the front of the door. Oh, what will happen next? Chapter 10, A Voice in the Dark. I'm going to read chapter 10. Okay. Jonathan crouched on his hands and knees, panting in the blackness. He'd never seen such darkness before, so total and suffocating. Down in the deepest dungeon, pinned beneath a prison of dark stone, there was hardly even the memory of light. His eyes gasped like the mouth of a fish yanked out of the water. They found no light to breathe. Ooh, I love the way this guy writes. His eyes found no light to breathe. That's great. He waited for arms to wrap around his waist, long, scaly fingers to close around his throat, teeth to pierce his shaking flesh. But one panicked breath passed, then another. All there was complete darkness and the sound of his fear gasping lungs and the same rhythmic watery thuds and sloshes of the hatch. The stone under his hands was moist and clammy. The frigid, hard floor began to hurt his knees. His racing heart began to slow down just enough for him to start to think. He tried to slow his lungs down. He felt with his hands and found the lantern. The glass was broken and he shook and he tapped it, but he knew that restarting it in the dark was impossible. He was lost in the dungeon of an asylum, in total darkness, with a skull. He couldn't help but wonder where the rest of the body was. Crap, he whispered, and tried not to freak out. Still on his hands and knees, he turned around and started crawling up the stairs, away from the hatch, his hands feeling through the inky black mystery in front of him. He found the steep stairs and tumbled up them, bumping his knees and knocking his elbow on the stone wall. Behind him, the hatch rumbled and chomped. He scrambled faster, climbing up the staircase to the landing. He tripped on the last step and fell, twisting onto his back. Something scrabbled away from him in the darkness, his sharp claws. It sounded big. Gasping, he jumped to his feet and felt for the walls. His breaths came fast and shallow. His heartbeat drummed in his head. He staggered with his hands reaching out in front of him like a blind man until his foot hit a stair and he fell again onto brutal stone. With the hatch behind him thumping as loudly as his heart in his ears, he raced up them in a stumbling crawl. He got to the top and felt the corner, a turn, and he shuffled with feeling fingers around it. The noise of the hatch got quieter. He kept one hand on the wall to his right and fumbled down a long corridor until he could no longer hear the hatch at all. He was still in absolute darkness, his eyes blinking and rolling and seeing nothing. He stopped for a moment to catch his breath and calm down, leaning against the wet stone wall. He dropped his head against the wall and sucked in great gasps of musty air and blew it out through his round lips until his lungs weren't heaving and his heart was merely pumping and not pounding. Then he remembered the rope. He'd never ducked under or run under into the rope stretched across the top of the stairwell, which could mean only one thing. He'd gone the wrong way. After his spinning fall on the landing, he must have stumbled up the wrong staircase, the one that had led in the opposite direction of the one he and Walter had come down. He gulped, and his breath started speeding up again. He'd have to backtrack, back down past the seething hatch, or go forward into the darkness and mystery and unexpected passages. Behind him dimly, he heard a sharp bang and a grumble. The hatch. It was just a door, a rusty, wet door of ancient iron that held something back. But for some reason, Jonathan felt like it was waiting for him, hungry in the dark. He clenched his teeth and took a step forward. The corridor was straight for a while, 10 or 15 steps. His fingers found one doorway, closed with a wooden door. so rotten it crumbled under his fingertips, but he continued past it. At the end of the straightway, the hall turned in a sharp L to the right, and Jonathan scooted around the corner. He stopped and listened, hoping to hear the voices of the other boys or even the sound of the ocean, which mean a window or a door to the outside. But there was only the always and everywhere sound of water dripping and his own echoey breaths and the occasional distant scratching of the claws in the dark. He took a step forward and the world was gone. His foot found only air beneath it, and he tried to catch himself on the wall, but there was no grip on the slimy surface, and he fell forward with a scream. Ah! Dank air whistled past his face. He thrust his arms desperately out in front of him, and then he slammed with horrible force onto a down staircase, the edges of the stairs like sharpened fists hammering his body. He slid and rolled and bounced down the stairs, each stair yanking a grunt or groan from him. At the bottom, gasping in blackness, he lay with his cheek in a cold puddle and felt each pain and pulse in his body. He flexed his fingers, he wiggled his toes, bent his knees and elbows. Nothing broken, he said out loud. His voice sounded small and alone in that empty darkness. There was the rusty taste of blood in his mouth. He was just pushing himself up to his hands and knees when he saw it. He froze in mid-crouch and tried to blink it away, but it was still there. Light, a thin light, glowing somewhere off ahead of him. With nothing else in the blackness for his eyes to compare it to, he couldn't tell if it was just out of reach of his fingers or 50 feet away, but it was there, shining in the darkness. He started crawling toward it, his knees and palms splashing through grimy puddles. The light got clearer, more solid around the edges. The line of light was coming from under a door. As he watched, a shadow moved across it, then was gone. Someone or something was moving on the other side of the door. Jonathan strained his ears for a sound, a voice, a laugh. Was it the other boys, the scars? Had he circled around in the darkness back to where he had started? He couldn't hear anything except maybe a low humming. He rose to his feet and took a step closer, then two more. Water leaked into his shoes. There it was again, a deep humming sound. He didn't know the tune, but it definitely wasn't one of the scars. It was the voice of a grown-up. He took one final step up to the door. His foot came down on a teetering pile of something stacked just outside the door. They clattered and crashed to the floor, shattering and skittering on the stones. The humming stopped. There was a grunt and a growl from behind the door. Jonathan took one step back, but then froze. The door jerked inward, flooding the corridor with yellow light. Jonathan's eyes burned, and he threw his arm over his face. A deep, rumbling voice, like wet boulders scraping together, rasped out of the blinding light. "What are you doing here?" That's the end. What are you doing here? So something is there saying, "What are you doing here?" Okay. A voice in the dark. What are you doing here? And the one we read before, Scar Island. So the island wasn't called Scar Island, but they called it Scar Island because they were the tough. After the scabs comes the scar. And they are the scars. Okay, that's cool. I'm telling you, reading a book twice, if it's a good book, it's good. It's good to do. It's not a bad thing. So number 9 was Scar Island, and we know who's in charge now. At least he thinks he is. And chapter 10, A Voice in the Dark. And tomorrow, let's see. Actually, another teacher has read this book. I was telling you maybe earlier that the Sycamore Room is a classroom in our school. I'm reading this for, and particularly, I started reading this book, and they've actually read the next few chapters. Another teacher I think, is going to fill in now and read chapters 11 through 15, and then I'll maybe pick up when we get to 16. So I get a little break in the action. And you can listen to Miss Amy, who is the assistant in the Sycamore Room. She's been reading the next few chapters. Just found that out when I posted this. But anyway, so I'll somehow figure out how to put that together for you to be able to access all the chapters. So we've read 1 through 10. Then she's going to read 11 through 15 or something. And then I'll pick up again, I think, is planned. But anyway, the next chapter that you should read with Amy, or hear Amy read, is called A Beautiful Rat. So one might think this beautiful voice came from a beautiful rat. A large, beautiful rat, maybe? I mean, one could think that. We don't know. But that's something to know. Until next time, when you read A Beautiful Rat, enjoy what you've read so far and reread it, maybe. Some of it, if you like. It's great. Have a good day. And this is Saturday, the 18th of April. And tomorrow is Patriots Day. That's why I have my quilt out here. I made a patriotic quilt. So, and I grew up in Lexington, Massachusetts, so I get razzle dazzle with this holiday. We always had parade, and I was often in the parade with Girl Scouts or something. So I hope we can't do any of that stuff, but there's a lot of things online to learn about your American history and the American Revolution. So you can Google American Revolution and see what you can find out. There's a good book that I like to read if I was at school, Sam the Minuteman. It's about a young boy that, if you could find that to read, Sam the Minuteman's about a boy and his father and how they participate, how their family is involved in some way in a little battle. Okay, have a good day. We'll talk to you later.